Have you ever had that feeling right in the middle, like a totally normal day, where you suddenly realize you are completely losing control of your own life?
Oh, absolutely. It's a pretty pervasive anxiety these days.
Right. And I'm not talking about, spilling your coffee or getting stuck in gridlock. I mean, that deep sinking sensation that your daily choices, your time, maybe even your fundamental rights are just kind of slipping through your fingers.
Yeah, like you're just following along on autopilot.
Exactly. You look at your schedule, the obligations you never really wanted to take on, the arbitrary rules you follow just to keep the peace, and you have to pause and ask, wait, who is actually running my life right now? Welcome to the Deep Dive, by the way. I'm your host, and with me is our resident expert to help figure out exactly who is running our lives.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. And to your point, that feeling of being boxed in is so common. Naturally, human instinct is to look outward to solve it.
We want someone to blame.
We really do. When we feel restricted, we immediately scan our environment for the architect of that restriction. We look for the demanding boss, the rigid institution, the broken system.
The oppressive society.
Right. We are constantly searching for the external oppressor.
We desperately want a villain in that story, someone else to point a finger at for the fact that our lives feel so constrained. But for today's deep dive, we're looking at a source that completely flips that narrative upside down.
It really does. It's a fascinating read.
Yeah, we are going to be exploring a highly provocative essay written in December of 2022 by Shufeng. And the title alone tells you exactly the kind of intellectual territory we're entering today. It's called The Greatest Responsibility for Losing Human Rights Lies with Oneself.
It is an incredibly bold premise.
It's massive. And the entire mission of this deep dive is to unpack this author's highly unconventional argument. He is presenting the idea that the erosion of our fundamental human autonomy isn't primarily the fault of, like, a tyrannical government or a corrupt system.
No, he says it's the direct result of our own continuous voluntary surrender.
Which is a heavy thing to hear.
Eh.
So before we get into the mechanics of this, we need to be crystal clear about our role today. This material steps into some highly sensitive, deeply philosophical debates about victimhood, systemic oppression, and personal responsibility.
Very politically charged concepts for sure.
Right. So we are not here to tell you whether this author is entirely right or horribly wrong. We're not taking a political or philosophical stance at all. Our job as your guides is simply to, map the architecture of this really fascinating argument.
We want to understand how the author constructs this worldview without necessarily telling you to move in and live there.
Exactly. We're just looking at the blueprints.
And the value of a text like this lies in its ability to force a re-examination of our own baseline assumptions. Whether the argument infuriates you or resonates with you, it demands that you think critically about how autonomy actually functions in the real world.
Rather than how we wish it functioned. Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author doesn't just launch into a vague tirade about freedom. He sets a very specific pre-political baseline.
He establishes what we're starting with.
Right. He outlines exactly what rights we have before society even enters the picture. According to the essay, human beings possess 8 innate freedoms, and he specifies that these are granted by heaven.
And by framing them as granted by heaven, he is establishing that these rights are inherent to the human condition. They aren't privileges handed down by a king, a constitution, or some voting bloc.
They exist the moment you exist.
Exactly, and he inventories them very clearly. It's the right to live, the right to create, the right to speak, personal freedom, the right to think, the right to learn, and the right to refuse.
It is a massive, sweeping list. You have biological existence, intellectual liberty, physical movement, all woven into these 8 pillars.
It covers pretty much everything.
But then the essay pivots to its core thesis. And this is the part that demands a double take. The author observes the world and concludes that as people go through their lives, these 8 rights are almost entirely wiped out.
They just vanish.
Yeah. And when he asks who took them, his answer is, well, it's us. We did. The greatest responsibility for losing these freedoms falls squarely on the individual.
He deliberately removes the external villain from the equation. He asks who has taken them away and forces the reader to look inward.
But I have to push back on the logic here because it feels intensely counterintuitive to everything we learn about history or sociology, right?
How so?
Well, the standard narrative of human civilization is a story of external forces. Dictators, empires, oppressive laws, all stripping rights away from populations. Reading this essay, a totally different analogy comes to mind.
Let's hear it.
It's like being handed the keys to a brand new top-of-the-line car, which represents those 8 innate rights. But driving requires focus, right? It involves navigating traffic, and there's the constant risk of a crash.
Sure, it takes effort.
Exactly. So because driving is exhausting, you voluntarily climb into the trunk, hand a stranger the wheel, lock yourself in, and then start screaming that you're trapped and blaming the manufacturer.
Oh, wow. That's a vivid way to put it.
It just feels like a brutal assessment of human psychology.
It is brutal, but if we connect this to the bigger picture, you can start to see the structural brilliance of why the author builds the argument this way. By placing the blame on the individual choosing to get into the trunk, he is entirely redefining the locus of control.
Redefining how we see victimhood.
Exactly. Think about the standard model of victimhood. If an external tyrant rips the keys from your hand and throws you in the trunk, you are a victim of circumstance. You have zero agency.
You're just trapped.
Right. But if you voluntarily lock yourself in because the responsibility of driving is too heavy, then the loss of freedom isn't a tragic twist of fate. It is a behavioral mechanism.
And logically, if surrendering your freedom is a behavioral choice, you inherently possess the power to simply make a different choice.
Precisely. It reframes the entire concept of oppression into something almost aggressively empowering.
If you are the one locking the door, you are the one holding the key.
It demands a radical level of self-interrogation. It asks what specific role the individual plays in constructing their own cage. But to really grasp how this operates, we have to look at how the author applies this abstract philosophy to tangible, physical reality.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The author moves from the macro concept of human rights to something deeply physical, which he calls personal freedom.
And he defines this very specifically.
Very literally. He defines it as the absolute right to freely control one's own body in time and space.
He strips away all the political rhetoric and boils freedom down to its biological baseline. What are you allowed to do with your physical form?
And the examples he provides are wonderfully mundane, almost eccentric, honestly.
They are pretty unique.
Yeah. He says pure personal freedom looks like this. You can have sex with whomever you want, provided the other person is a willing participant. You can decide to take a bath in the middle of the night. You can get a tattoo. Or, my personal favorite, you can eat a meal while standing up.
Eating while standing up, it's so specific.
Right. They are such quirky, trivial things, but they perfectly illustrate the point. It is the absolute frictionless right to govern your physical vessel without needing to consult a committee.
Those mundane examples are crucial, though, because they represent actions that inflict no harm on anyone else. Eating while standing up doesn't disrupt the social order.
Right. Nobody's getting hurt.
It is the purest expression of spatial autonomy. The friction only begins when we willingly invite other entities into that space.
Which brings us to the most surprising leap in the text. The author takes this idea of frictionless bodily autonomy and points to what he considers the ultimate example of how we voluntarily obliterate it: marriage.
It is a jarring pivot for most readers.
Completely jarring. He argues that the moment you sign a marriage certificate, at least half of your personal freedom immediately vanishes. Your body, your time, your space, they're no longer under your exclusive control.
Because now you have to coordinate.
Exactly. You have to compromise. You can't just jump into the bathtub at 3 a.m. with the lights blazing if it's going to wake up your spouse. And his ultimate point is, nobody forced you to the altar. You chose to sign the paper, thereby self-inflicting a massive restriction on your own human rights.
The author is analyzing social institutions through a radically detached, almost mathematical lens here.
Very clinical.
Right. He isn't looking at marriage as a beautiful romantic partnership or a foundation for family. He is evaluating it strictly as a spatial and behavioral contract that inherently restricts autonomy.
But isn't there a massive flaw in equating a compromise with an oppression? I mean, think about the social contract. I willingly give up my right to blast music at 3 a.m. or eat crackers in bed, and in exchange, I receive love, companionship, and a shared life.
The trade-off is the whole point for most people.
Right. Framing that voluntary trade-off as a tragic loss of human rights seems to completely ignore the emotional reality of why human beings connect in the first place.
It does, but the author's philosophy requires him to ignore that emotional reality. He groups wildly different types of restrictions under the exact same umbrella because he is entirely focused on the mechanics of surrender, not the motivation.
Just the math of it.
Exactly. And we see this even more clearly when he moves straight from marriage to his next subject, which is the penal system.
Oh man, that transition gave me whiplash.
It's extreme.
He looks at people who are locked in prison cells, and he argues that even in a maximum security environment, the loss of personal freedom is largely self-inflicted.
Which is a very tough pill to swallow.
For sure. He states that for the vast majority of people behind bars, they are there because they chose to act irrationally, they broke laws, or they harmed others. Their impulsiveness is what landed them in a cage.
Notice the structural parallel he is drawing here. He looks at a voluntary social bond rooted in love, which is marriage, and a punitive consequence rooted in malice or impulsivity, which is prison.
To most of us, those are complete opposites.
Exactly. But to this author, there are identical mechanisms. In both scenarios, an individual made an initial choice that resulted in their physical body being restricted by external forces.
Wow.
He strips away the societal context and focuses purely on causality. You chose to marry, you chose to commit a crime, therefore you authored your own physical confinement.
It is a breathtakingly stark way to view human existence. Every choice is just a ledger entry adding up to less freedom.
Right.
And while the marriage and prison examples deal with heavy structural physical restrictions, the essay then moves into a space that is so much more insidious because it happens entirely in our own heads.
We move from physical autonomy to psychological and social autonomy.
Yeah, we need to talk about another innate freedom on his list.
Yeah.
The right to refuse.
Functionally, this might be the most critical pillar of his entire philosophy. He defines the right to refuse as the absolute, uncompromising power to reject anything you do not wish to accept.
Anything at all.
Anything. It applies to ideologies, beliefs, alternative lifestyles, favors, demands, and gifts. It is the sovereign power of the word no.
And here is the gut punch statistic he drops. He claims that over 90% of people voluntarily surrender this specific right. 90% of us just give up the ability to refuse.
And, when you examine the sociology of how this happens, that 90% figure starts to look alarmingly accurate.
Really? You think it's that high?
I do, because the surrender of refusal doesn't happen in grand cinematic moments of standing in front of a tank. It happens in the quiet, mundane friction of daily life.
Think about your own week. I want you, the listener, to really picture this. The author lists out these everyday coercions, and they are incredibly visceral.
We all face them.
When your parents continuously pressured you about settling down and getting married, did you firmly refuse, or did you eventually cave? When your grown children demanded you dip into your retirement to help them buy a house or a new car, did you refuse?
Or when your boss asked you to give up your weekend to work unpaid overtime, did you look them in the eye and say no?
And the text pushes further into darker territory, too. Did you exercise your right to refuse when a subordinate subtly offered you a bribe?
Did you say no when an intimidating superior demanded you go out drinking with them to secure a promotion?
These moments seem so disjointed, right? A pushy parent versus a corrupt subordinate. But the text argues they're exactly the same thing. We often convince ourselves that saying yes to these things is just the cost of doing business.
We want to be a supportive parent, an agreeable employee, a team player.
But the author says, no, these aren't just polite compromises for the sake of social harmony. Every time you swallow your true feelings and say yes, when your mind is screaming no, you are actively trading away a piece of your innate humanity.
It's death by 1,000 cuts. The author is mapping out an entire ecosystem of systemic coercion. He purposefully places domestic emotional pressures, like a guilt-tripping parent, right alongside systemic corruption, like a bribing subordinate or an overreaching boss.
Why lump those together?
He does this to demonstrate that the origin of the pressure doesn't actually matter. Whether the pressure comes wrapped in familial love or professional intimidation, the internal boundary mechanism being tested is identical.
And he emphasizes that we are surrounded by these tests. We face pressure from governments, police officers, corporate managers, our own friends, and outright thugs.
And time after time, we reluctantly give in.
We prioritize avoiding conflict over maintaining our own boundaries.
We often visualize the loss of freedom as a sudden, violent explosion, someone blowing up a dam. But the author is suggesting something far more tragic.
What's that?
It's not an explosion. It is a community collectively deciding to remove one brick from the dam every single day because dealing with the friction of maintaining it is just too exhausting.
And over time, the structural integrity vanishes, and the flood inevitably follows,
Exactly.
which perfectly sets up the final and most terrifying segment of this essay, the macro consequences of all these micro choices. What actually happens to civilization when 90% of the population simultaneously abandons their right to refuse?
The text reaches a chilling logical conclusion. The author states that when the majority abandons the right to refuse, small and large tyrants are born.
Small and large tyrants. It starts with the bully on the playground who realizes no one will push back.
Right.
Then it scales up to the toxic middle manager who realizes the staff will always work weekends. And eventually it scales all the way up to the corrupt head of state. The essay argues that this collective societal surrender creates the incredibly fertile soil in which thugs, bullies, and corrupt officials take root and thrive.
He is drawing a direct, undeniable line from your reluctance to upset your boss to the rise of global authoritarianism.
I have a wild connection to make.
But think about it. Every time an individual fails to exercise their right to refuse, they signal to those seeking power that boundaries are merely suggestions. They prove that resistance is a bluff.
Wow.
The text argues that the ultimate consequence of this ambient compliance is that civilization itself is stifled, and darkness shrouds the earth for a long time.
So what does this all mean? The sheer scale of this argument is almost paralyzing. The author is concluding that the loss of all other freedoms, your right to speak, to create, to merely exist, all traces back to this one foundational failure point. We just couldn't bring ourselves to say no.
It's a heavy burden to place on the individual.
It is. And this brings me back to the problem of real-world violence. Is this text unfairly blaming the victims of systemic oppression? I mean, if a corrupt police officer or a dictator has a weapon and you give up your right to refuse because you don't want to lose your life, it feels incredibly harsh to label that a voluntary surrender.
Right. The stakes are totally different.
Or, conversely, is this actually the most empowering message possible? Is the author trying to remind us that tyranny is a fragile illusion that only functions through our continued compliance?
This raises an important question about the actual mechanics of power. The author isn't necessarily ignoring the reality of state violence. Rather, he is arguing that tyranny is almost never imposed purely from the top down in a vacuum.
It has to have a foundation.
Right. It grows from the bottom up. Authoritarianism requires an immense amount of ambient compliance to function. A tyrant cannot arrest an entire population if every single member of that population simultaneously refuses to cooperate.
This system would just break.
Exactly. The raw power of the oppressor is entirely subsidized by the psychological submission of the oppressed.
Because the math simply doesn't work for the tyrant. There are never enough police, thugs, or bosses to force compliance if 100% of the population plants their feet and absolutely refuses to yield.
But the fertile soil the author warns about is our conditioned habit of submission.
Right. We practice it every day.
We practice compliance with our parents to keep the peace. We practice it with our employers to keep our jobs. By the time a truly unjust demand is made by a corrupt government, our psychological reflex is already deeply trained to submit.
We've forgotten how to use the muscle of refusal.
Yes. Therefore, his final thesis holds firm. The loss of human rights ultimately traces back to the individual's daily, voluntary surrenders.
It is a profoundly heavy realization to sit with. Just think about the philosophical ground we have covered in this deep dive. We started with something as granular and intimate as a midnight bath and eating while standing up.
The pure joy of an unrestricted physical body.
Yeah. Then we navigated the complex ways we voluntarily restrict that body through the social compromises of marriage or the impulsive actions that land us in a prison cell.
And from the physical realm, we moved into the psychological. We examined the right to refuse, uncovering the uncomfortable truth that our desire for social harmony constantly overrides our commitment to our own autonomy.
And finally, we arrived at that staggering, almost terrifying conclusion. The idea that your quiet failure to tell a demanding relative or an overreaching boss no is the exact mechanism that paves the way for global tyranny.
It's all connected.
The small daily surrenders of our boundaries are the bricks we use to build our own cages.
The text ultimately serves as a mirror. It demands a heightened state of vigilance regarding our own agency in every interaction, no matter how small.
And that is exactly why this essay matters so much to you, the listener. We all navigate these pressures every single day. So the next time you find yourself backed into a corner, the next time you feel immense pressure to accept an ideology you despise, a favor that feels like a trap, or a demand that violates your boundaries, you can think back to the architecture of this argument.
Use it as a tool.
Exactly. You can pause, take a breath, and ask yourself, am I about to voluntarily surrender my right to refuse? Am I planting another seed in the soil that grows tyrants? It inserts a powerful moment of pure agency into your life before you ever open your mouth to answer.
It provides you with a sharp analytical tool. You don't have to endorse his clinical view of marriage or his dismissal of external oppression to profoundly benefit from recognizing the latent power of your own refusal.
Absolutely. And as we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to explore on your own. It takes everything we've unpacked today and pushes it to its absolute logical extreme.
I love these kinds of thought experiments.
So if the fundamental root of lost freedom is our collective failure to reject what we do not want, what would happen if, for just 24 hours, every single person on Earth universally, uncompromisingly, exercised their right to refuse?
Oh, wow.
Every time someone was asked to do something they didn't genuinely want to do, they simply said no. Would this unified global chorus of refusal lead to an instant utopian liberation of humanity? Or would the sudden evaporation of all social compliance result in the absolute catastrophic collapse of society as we know it?
It is a deeply fascinating paradox to leave unresolved.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems around you, keep a close eye on your own daily choices, and always remember to check who is really driving the car.